Well, Tony, your perspective, I mean, Keith talked about the incompetence of the political leadership right now. Would you say that that's the major problem? Or as he pointed out, dealing with Brexit or the pandemic, how do you evaluate the main problems and this lack, it seems, of organization and consistency that we're seeing?
Well, look, first of all, to say I'm not actually in Bristol today. By a marvellous stroke of serendipity, I happen to be in Peterborough, which is at the heart of the UK's national distribution network. And I've been driving around today past some of the biggest distribution hubs in the country. IKEA, which is a big furniture right around Europe, but it's very big in Britain. Their base, Amazon's base, and I see lorries streaming in and out of these non-essential places, including big furniture distribution hubs. There's no shortage of lorries around here. I've been sitting in traffic jams with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lorries right behind each other, and this is where the lorries go out around the country. You know, the Americans call them trucks. We still, in Britain, most of us anyway, call them lorries. Now, this story, I think, has been fascinating to watch unfold. The one particularly about the fuel shortages. Of course, they were very good, the BBC, on Thursday evening when the story first broke. I was listening to the bulletins to say there is no real fuel shortage. It's just a shortage of drivers, and 1 or 2 fuel stations might not have enough fuel. Well, of course, that is guaranteed to do one thing, and that is to start panic buying the next day. And the other thing I saw was the increase overnight in the fuel prices at the petrol stations. Increases of between 5 and 10 pence a litre just that evening after the story broke. So this, to me, says one thing, and the reason I'll underline this is because I know for a fact, having seen particularly lots of these vehicles going around, lorries going around, and trucks in and around Northamptonshire, is that the fuel companies are the most profitable in the world. If anyone can guarantee high pay and a guaranteed pay for their lorry drivers, truck drivers, then it's the BPs, the ESSOs of this world. They have no shortage of cash. Their profit margins are the highest in the whole of the Western world, as many shareholders who invested them will attest. And so the idea that they cannot afford to keep fully staffed their distribution networks, to me, is utter nonsense. And I was really appalled to see that the BBC, when they're reporting this story, don't comment on the fact that the oil corporations in the West anyway operate as a cartel. The idea that one is any separate to the other, they all work in concert. And of course, they are global corporations. They're all anti-Brexit. They're all Remainers, or as we still call people who still want to be part of the EU, Remainiacs, who still want to plough this furrow. So I'm absolutely convinced that this is a collusion, really, between the big oil companies and the big media, all based in London, to really just bamboozle the public into panic buying, effectively. So it's a very irresponsible type of journalism. And as we know, there is no real fuel shortage, but it creates a sense of panic to see people queuing up. And I think it's an absolutely appalling misuse of the broadcasting networks and the newspapers to try and panic people in this way. If there was a problem at a few fuel stations, then, people would hardly notice. But the idea that you're saying, you're going to have to fill your cars up tomorrow, and then making an extra load of money by putting the fuel up overnight, to me, it's a cynical abuse and misuse. And actually, of course, this is really about pay. It's not about a driver shortage. It's about people not being paid enough. And if these various distribution companies started to give decent wages to these lorry drivers, which is that's exactly what people should be doing. If you've got a shortage, you start to pay your people more. It's a very antisocial job. You're spending many nights away from home. You have to sit in traffic jams, wait for roadworks to be finished for hours sometimes, crawling forwards. It's a horrible job to have to do. And so these people need to be paid properly. And then in which case the distribution networks will be back up and running tomorrow.
What do you think about that, Keith? That was interesting what Tony said. The globalists versing basically the Brexit individuals. Your take on this? I mean, how much of this is created and how much of this is real?
Well, a lot of it is real, I'm afraid. I mean, you may be in Peterborough watching it all distributed. That's true. There's going to be a lot of trucks there by the very nature. But the point is that there's not just fuel shortages, there's shortages on the shelves. People are queuing to get an appointment with their GP. I mean, the idea that there's not just these problems are just nothing to do with Brexit and the labour shortage in Britain is, unbelievable. We may be Remainiacs, many of us will turn into rejoiners, I think. And the point is that it's widespread throughout the economy. It's not doing well. Global Britain is failing to do trade deals with America, as promised. The Australians, it doesn't really matter. We do so little trade with them anyway. That's the reality. And so to deny that Brexit doesn't play a role in this is unbelievable. And of course, if you've got queues of people, you're going to raise your price. That's called capitalism. And the person that makes the most money out of fuel in Britain is, in fact, the government. So when you fill up with your litre of petrol, something like 75% actually goes to the government. 75%. So the idea that the profiteering companies have got all this money, the BP share price has not done well over the years. So there's a number of inaccuracies from your previous correspondent, I'm afraid. And the labour market is tough in Britain at the moment, finding the people with the skills and prepared to do these low-paid jobs. Of course, pay will go up. That's how a market economy works. And if there's a shortage of lawyers, but it doesn't happen overnight. All right, the shortage is 100,000. So you don't train 100,000 people to drive these trucks overnight and bringing in the army.
Well,
like
let's just stop right there. The shortages. Let me just jump in here, Keith, because the shortage you're saying is 100,000. I mean, couldn't this have been foreseen? It's not something that it's just say a couple of hundred. I mean, that's a lot of people. It took it to get to this point for the government to realize that there's a crisis. I mean, how do you see it?
Well, the government's been warned about it for months. It's been going on for months. Industry has been telling them pre-Brexit we needed a good deal. We needed certain occupations. We needed seasonal workers for the farmers because they're all planning less crops next year, not more or less, because they haven't got the workers to pick it. So the government has been ignoring all these calls because their beloved Brexit. We're seeing the costs. And eventually people will wake up and realise what a costly, wasteful and expensive exercise Brexit has been. And of course, what's the sad thing about this? It's not the rich that are going to suffer. The rich have got plenty of money to fall back on savings. Ultimately, it's the people that were brought on board by Boris and his cronies that voted for this. And they're going to be the poor people often that, former Labour voters, and they've been sucked into the Conservative Brexit fanatical game, and now they're the people who are going to most suffer from it all.
Okay. Well, Tony, what about that? I mean, it just seems that there was not a whole lot of calculation into the chain effect of decisions that were made.
Well, look, I'm old enough to remember the real fuel shortages we had in Britain back in 1973, where we had queuing outside petrol stations for months on end, where that was caused by the Yom Kippur War, the October War.
Sorry to jump in here. I'm not just talking about the petrol right now.
Yeah,
I'm just talking about in general.
What I'm saying is that was a real fuel shortage. Mm-hmm. This is not. And I go back to my initial point that these fuel companies can easily afford to pay properly drivers who will work for them, but they have chosen to use this as an excuse, really, to cause panic. Whilst Boris Johnson was at least anyway away in the United States, so that's one of the reasons I think this has taken place.
So, Keith, overall, tell me, how do you see this affecting the British people? You just now, you alluded to, of course, as always, it's the poor people who suffer. But in general, how do you see it overall affecting the people, and how will it affect the electorate in general when going to the polls?
Well, it's going to take some time. I mean, if you look at the opinion polls, it's almost astonishing that Boris is still in the lead. If you look at opinion polls, but you can only keep giving people bad news for so long. And of course, there's going to be more bad news for a lot of people. The furlough scheme ends in September. That's been supportive of a lot of people. That ends. The universal benefit, £20 a week, is going to end, which is £80 a month for a lot of people. In London, there's about to impose a congestion charge, ULEZ zone, that's going to affect a lot of people with older cars. They're generally poorer people. So there's a lot of bills, higher gas and electric bills coming, not just starting in October. There's going to be a further rise in April. And inflation picking up and wage growth not keeping up with inflation. So, there's a lot more bad news to come, I'm afraid. And that is going to take its toll eventually.
Tony, your thoughts. You were shaking your head a bit. Do you see brighter days ahead as Keith are actually seeing the opposite? Or tell me, why were you shaking your head?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite clear to me there's a war going on, basically, and that is between the globalists and people who are, should we call them Brexiteers, but, nationalist Brits who have seen what's been going on with the European Union and are signalling to the rest of Europe that maybe they should think about getting out of the EU too, because this club in Brussels has proven to be effectively a kind of a Fourth Reich. In other words, it's run by big corporations for their own personal private benefit, and there's no real democracy involved at all. They've got a parliament of a whole bunch of people who can't actually make any laws. All they can do is try and slow down things by the people who are appointed to the top of the European Union. I think, yes, we are going to be under assault. It's quite obvious that's what's going to happen from those globalists. And these fuel companies, and, by the way, the BBC, are very much pro those globalist influences. In fact, they get paid. The BBC still get money from some of these globalist influencers. I think we've got every bit of possibility of pulling through all this. We have a fairly stiff upper lip, we like to say, and we will deal with these problems. But what doesn't help is when you've got the mass media actually fueling the fire. And the mass media have driven this panic buying. There is no shortage of fuel in Britain. There is actually no shortage of drivers to do fuel distribution because these companies, Keith, as I say, have the money to pay them.
I mean, Tony, what about, because as I said, we're just not talking about the petrol prices right now. As Keith had talked about earlier, just overall energy costs and their the stocks as far as in the stores are not being well stocked. I mean, overall, do you see that the cause of all of this is related to what? Is it just something that's created again because of the globalists, or how do you see it?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think what we're looking at now is main infrastructure in the country coming under attack from various angles. This isn't just accidental shortages. Of course, arterial distribution, for example, of food around the country is now very, very centralised. We've just had one of our major supermarkets, one of the big four in Britain, has been taken over by American hedge funds. And that old supermarket, Morrison's, they used to deal direct with farmers. In the future, all of the meat that comes to those supermarkets will be going through the main meat distributors in the country, not direct from the farmers to the customers anymore. So there is an attempt to bring all of this national infrastructure, I would call it, like fuel, like food, all the other things too, and energy, into private hands. And in those private hands, those private companies can work together to squeeze the supply, to cause panic, and then they can make many, many more profits. And I think we should see these kinds of infrastructures brought back into national ownership so they could be run for the interests of the population rather than for the shareholders of those companies.
Keith, how do you see what Tony's assessment just now?
Well, I mean, we try to run a capitalist society, a mixed economy. We certainly don't want to nationalise everything, and private sector does many, many good things, OK? So that's nonsense. But what is clear that the only booming the only booming business in Britain at the moment is bureaucracy and filling in forms, the Northern Ireland Protocol. Every farmer will tell you exporting has been a nightmare. You can see it in the figures. The Brexiteers may deny it, but the figures are staggering, the fall in trade with the EU, and that similar trade has not been affected outside of the EU. So they're denying it. They caused the problem. People voted for it. They voted for a fall in their living standards. That's what people have voted for. They voted for less funds for the government, less tax. Therefore, their tax must go up if they want the similar level of government services. And that means the government becomes a bigger part of the economy. So you can't have it both ways. If you want your sort of national identity and keep the immigrants out, well, you can have
sovereignty.
That,
no, I'm not saying that. I didn't say anything about immigrants, did I? I think it's quite fair to keep going with immigration where it's necessary, and I'm not against immigration. I think there should be, basic rights, of course, for people like asylum seekers. I'm not against that at all. But I think you've got to run the national economy in the national interest, and we can only do that where the private predators are not preying on their distribution networks and their monopolies to fleece the public for the benefit of their shareholders.
Okay, and I have to thank both of you for a lively discussion and being with me on this spotlight. Unfortunately, we're out of time, out of London. Keith Pilbeam, author and professor of international economics out of Bristol. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Appreciate it. And as always, viewers, appreciate you being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Hope to see you right here, same time tomorrow. Goodbye.